Thank you very much, Ted, and thanks to all of you for coming today. I'm really honored to be invited here, not just personally, but in that you chose a representative of the Global South. I think there's increasing recognition apropos inclusiveness being part of your code of conduct of the role that people in the Global South are playing in science and the increasingly sophisticated, serious, and important research they're contributing. It was a real opportunity for me to go from PLOS to Nairobi so that I could share some of the experiences that we had been undergoing in the US and also to some extent in Europe, because I have to say that I think Europe has always been at the forefront of open science as opposed to the US. Many people think that PLOS was the first open access publisher. That's not the case. It was Biomed Central, founded by Vitek Trotz in the UK. And anyway, there was much receptivity to the notion of open science and already a great deal of familiarity that I found there. And so it was a natural fit for me, and I'm really delighted that there's recognition by virtue of this invitation today. I'm also really pleased to learn of the activities of the social sciences in open science advocacy. It's entirely a result of my background and naivete and limited exposure that I've always been very focused on the life sciences. For 14 years, I was director of the American Society for Cell Biology, which was a real hub for promoting open access publishing. And the social sciences, I confess in my mind, were always somewhere on the periphery. And just sitting through the sessions yesterday, it's clear that you've taken a leadership role in this area, and I want to applaud you for that and encourage your continued interactions with other parts of the globe and other areas of science. I apologize in advance to those of you who were present yesterday and heard my brief remarks on the panel, because some of this will overlap, but I hope you will understand you have my permission to turn to your screens when I'm saying something you already heard. This is the Academy, as I say, based in Nairobi. And by the way, if you've never been to Nairobi, it's a beautiful place. I encourage you to come. The Academy is an institution. It's the leading funder of science across Africa. It serves all countries in Africa. Often when people, especially people from the global north like me, refer to Africa, they're talking about sub-Saharan Africa. But when I say Africa, I mean Africa, all of Africa. So we fund science in all of Africa and across every discipline of science. Having said that, our major funders are Gates and Wellcome. So inevitably, most of our money goes to the biomedical and medical sciences because that's the interest of those nonprofits. We have a long way to go in terms of attracting money in the other sciences for the other sciences, and most importantly, to encourage African governments themselves to fund science, because we'll never get away from the sort of colonial mindset of money coming from the north to support the South, and inevitably, on some level, controlling what is done with that money, unless we are able to successfully convey to African governments themselves why funding science should be a priority for them. That's hard enough in the global north because generally funding science reaps benefit beyond the political time horizon of the person you're talking to. So it takes a lot of courage and foresight to make it a priority, but it doesn't mean that we won't continue to try. So the Academy has three major areas of interest. The first is that we recognize excellence, and in this regard, it's something like the National Academy of Sciences in the US or the UK Royal Society, in that we name a small number of fellows every year, excellent African researchers who are conferred the honor of being a fellow of the AAS. We are an advisory and a think tank organization. We develop white papers and other thought pieces and advocate for science, as I was saying before. So that's the second function of the Academy. And then the third function is all lumped in under this implementing key STI programs, which means we apply for money from anybody who will give it to us to fund science, and then we act like the NIH or the NSF in that we review those applications and allocate it as optimally as we can. As I said, we cover all the sciences. Obviously, environment and climate change is of intense interest to all people in Africa, and of course, especially scientists who represent that area, and the other areas are obviously also valuable, and we constantly seek to find funding for all these areas. There are big problems facing Africa. There always have been, and as there are big problems facing everywhere in the world, but in Africa they may be most acute in these areas. Climate change is really threatening right now because of the extreme climates that already exist in many parts of Africa, the deserts, the arid conditions, and then conversely, the intense flooding areas. It promises or it threatens to really impact the economies, livelihoods, and very lives of people in Africa, both directly and indirectly. So you know all the ways they can do this. It affects flooding, for example, and droughts affect migration patterns for wild animals. Wild animals are the major attractor of tourism on the continent, so on and on. There are a lot of repercussions. There's also a lot of virtual transfer of water within the continent, meaning that water-demanding crops are grown in one place and transferred to other places that don't have as much water. Anyway, the impacts of climate change are very serious and may be more serious in Africa than anywhere in the world. Highly related is food insecurity. There is a baseline of many millions of people who are food insecure in Africa, and these changes in climate threaten to make that problem worse. Also related poverty and high disease burden and epidemiological transition. Now, I'll get back to the epidemiological transition because this is something I hadn't really thought about until I moved to Nairobi 3 years ago, but it's very real in Africa. I think, so the only point I want to make from this slide is that our guiding principle, if you will, is shifting the center of gravity for African science to Africa, to enable African scholars to control and run their own scientific interests rather than being dependent on funders in the global north. About the epidemiological shift, it's actually quite interesting. We're going through a very pronounced shift from communicable disease to non-communicable diseases. So, in other words, there's been a lot of focus, for example, on malaria and AIDS, which of course have been big problems in Africa. Now, thankfully, AIDS is being effectively addressed through a number of means. It's not eradicated by any means, but it's I'll say more under control than it was 20 years ago. But at the same time, people in Africa in very large numbers are transitioning to the diseases of the global north. So they're experiencing diabetes, heart disease, et cetera, those diseases that those of us who have an abundance of food are experiencing. They, as Africa becomes more stable and more economically wealthy, there hadn't traditionally been much focus on the difference between calories and nutritious calories, for example. If, you know, people in villages, for anybody who's been to Africa, are bombarded with, you know, Coca-Cola advertisements and that kind of thing. So now we have to enter into a new phase of public health messaging that helps make this distinction between surviving and surviving in a healthy manner, exactly as we're experiencing in the US. I'm sure all of you are familiar, or most of you are familiar with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. They succeed the Millennium Development Goals. They're very high-level principles for the development of Africa, and they're being approached through various frameworks. The most common framework you may have heard about is the WEF framework. That's water, environment, and food. And there are various variations. The middle one is energy, water, energy, and food. But there are various variations such as WEFI that adds the environment in there, et cetera. And so the big challenge is how to tackle these problems and achieve the goals, the very, as I say, high-level goals set out by the SDGs in a manner that's coordinated, because, as everyone knows, there's a certain degree of zero sum. When you approach one problem, you're going to have an impact on another problem. So to shift now to open access publishing, as I mentioned yesterday, when I got to the Academy 3 years ago, there was literally a contract on my desk that I was asked to sign proposing a journal for Africa to be published by Elsevier. And so I really endeared myself to my colleagues at the Academy, saying, not on your life, we're going to do something different. And so we saw the fact that there was very little in terms of broad publishing in Africa, an opportunity to introduce an open access platform that kind of tackled all at once the many issues that we've known for decades have existed. There's a certain opportunity when nothing's there and you don't have to fight anyone in terms of their interests versus your interests. There was nobody to fight. So we decided we're going to do it in a better way, and we're going to launch an open access platform, which we did in coordination with F1000, founded by the same Vitek Trats that I referred to before, on the model of Gates Open Research and Welcome Open Research. And we consider this to be a very applicable model for Africa for a number of reasons. I believe you're all familiar with the problem of subscription publishing, or as I prefer to call it, closed access publishing, in that you have to pay, the taxpayers at the end of the day are paying multiple times for the same research. This is a problem that's exacerbated in Africa because there's so little money dedicated to research in the first place. It takes a long time to get science out. This is, again, you know, an even bigger problem for African scientists who are struggling to establish themselves as credible in the eyes of their global colleagues. That there's limited access to content and data. If your work isn't mineable and findable, then you're going to not get out of the box in terms of your colleagues knowing you. The wasted intellectual contribution is still a big problem everywhere in the world. Reviewers get no credit, often get no exposure. And they're, by the way, doing all their work for free. There's a big supply problem in terms of peer review, et cetera. There has to be some recognition for peer reviewers and conversely, nobody but the authors and the editors see the work product of peer reviewers. That's a valuable research output that should be shared with the rest of the world, that is, those interested in that field of research. And of course, the bias resulting from lack of transparency, which again, African researchers may suffer from more than the rest of the world because their institutions are unfamiliar to reviewers in the global north. Their names are hard to pronounce. They didn't do their postdoc with your buddy. These are all issues that enter into subconscious bias and make publishing even harder for authors in the global south than the global north. And articles traditionally are static as opposed to dynamic. So we launched AAS Open Research, an open publishing platform 3 years ago. It's based on the principles of research integrity, reproducibility, an open data policy. We require all data be deposited, all data relevant to the claims being made, findable, mineable, searchable. We are built on a model of open post-publication peer review that I will talk about a little bit more, and transparency. It doesn't mean that everything published there is true. I think John published the most popular ever article in a PLOS journal that was entitled something like why 99% of research articles are not true. What was it called? It's an inflated claim. But you get the idea, and I'm sure it's still the most popular article in a PLOS journal, but you know, it's true, and transparency only can, even if it's only 89 or 59, transparency can only affect that positively. So again, as I was saying yesterday, we encourage the submission not just of the standard research article, but any research output that can be peer reviewed. And this is an important feature because there is so much wasted research output in science. We talked yesterday, apropos null findings, about it not being worth writing up a null finding because it's not even worth the effort because it's so likely to be rejected by a worthwhile journal. And that's generally been the case in the past. We honor null findings. We understand that null findings are findings, and they're very important to those in the field who are trying to build their research and who need all the available information and to know of the work of people who came before them, no matter what the findings were. So we, in addition to traditional research articles, we encourage systematic reviews, research protocols, replication and confirmatory studies, data notes, null findings, as I was saying, case reports, software, anything that can be valuable as a research output. One of the main features of AAS Open Research on this platform is that the work gets out quickly, because research delayed is research denied. And this is particularly true perhaps in the biomedical sciences, that where the output is so intense, maybe less true in the physical sciences, where a scholar may put out, you know, one paper in 3 years because it's the result of a huge team project. But regardless, the principle is the same, that the quicker you can get your findings out, the more valuable it is for building upon by other scientists. So that gives you some parameters for how quickly we're able to get the work out. So how does it work? We start with the submission, whatever it is. It is reviewed within a week, and it is reviewed, obviously, in that short amount of time, only to make sure that all the elements are in place, the required data is there, and that it's actually science, not nonsense. there's no value assigned to the quality of the research or the nature of the findings. At that point, the data is accessible. This is very important so that people can build on it. The article is considered published and it can be cited as such, and the peer review process is initiated at that point. At this point, the peer review process is the same as it is in a traditional journal structure. The peer reviewers are invited. When we get commitments for peer review, they submit their peer review, authors respond, revise, improve, etc. in response to the peer review. But in the meantime, the article has already been published. At the point that the, article has reached a certain level of passing peer review, which we have defined as either approvals from 2 peer reviewers or an approval and 2 conditional approvals, then the article is indexed in all the major indices. And this is extremely important in Africa because many of the journals in which African scholars have heretofore published are not indexed, and therefore they're kind of dead in the water because they're not findable by other scholars. This is what a paper looks like. You can see the referee status. It's got 2 unconditional approvals, and therefore it is being indexed. You can see the versioning. All the different versions in the course of peer review are archived and readily accessible to any reader, etc. So it's retaining all this information. It's inviting the reader to benefit from the intellectual exchange between peer reviewer and author. And it's promoting transparency in the process of publication. This is what I was talking about before. If it reaches 2 unconditional approvals or 1 unconditional approval and 2 conditional approvals, which in editorial language you might be familiar with as passing peer review with revisions or subject to changes and so forth. We also offer article level metrics, downloads, and views, etc., to try to encourage our constituency to get away from the dreaded impact factor, which we think is a very negative influence, not only on the practice of publishing science, but on science itself, because there's evidence that people design their science around what will get into a high impact factor journal. And impact factors, as I'm sure many of you know, were never even intended to reflect the quality of a particular paper. And the fact that they are invoked as conferring quality on a paper. I had a paper in science, and therefore it's a great paper. That's making many leaps and claims that simply aren't the case. And conversely, my paper was turned down by Science Nature Cell and everything else. It's a bad paper. Not so. The value of a paper is the inherent value of that paper, not of the value of the journal to which it was submitted and accepted. Where do open publishing platforms, notice I have not used the word journal, open publishing platforms fit in the spectrum of publishing opportunities for scientists? I made up this little chart because it can be very confusing. When I first explained what we were doing at AAS, people said, oh, so this is a preprint server. No, it's not a preprint server, but there are elements of a preprint server in it. So I made this up to show that what you have is gold OA journals. An example of that is PLOS. It makes the content and the data accessible without barriers. It provides full peer review. It is considered a publication. It has a DOI. It's indexed. So a lot of good value there. And then you have preprint servers that provide access without barriers, that eliminates delays, that are dynamic, that has a DOI, but it's not a publication. Then you have open platforms, which attempts to combine all these factors to have the best of everything within one option. So what open platforms do is they provide full accessibility to readers without delay or barriers. They provide peer review at the same level of quality as any other journal. It is considered a publication. It is dynamic. It gets a DOI, and it is indexed. So it's intended to address these many problems that we have dealt with over the decades to be a publishing solution that works for African scholars. Probably most of you are familiar with Plan S that comes out of Europe. The African Academy of Sciences is a signatory to Plan S. It is meant to promote value for research funders by demanding that, that research is made available immediately. They're even moving away from hybrid options in which you can pay for your article to be made open access within a closed access journal. And it's actively supporting journals who wish to transition from a less progressive model to a more progressive model. I think Plan S is key because it recognizes explicitly that you can say what you want, but at the end of the day, the people who control the money control the science. It's just a reality. And so this focuses on the interests of funders and shows them and helps them transition to a progressive model of publishing for the people that they fund. I joined a group called Ambassadors, people from around the world who are helping to promote Plan S, and some of whom were involved in the very early days of open access publishing. As I touched on before, it demands immediate publishing, no barriers, no copyright transfer, so the author maintains control, transparency, no more of these secret bundling subscription contracts, etc. Funders must commit to supporting APCs, very important. It tries to be broad in terms of how publishers get to compliance, and it commits to article level metrics as opposed to journal level metrics or impact factors. This to me is interesting because it's the first actual data that I've seen that says if your article is published open access, it is indeed more likely to be viewed. It seems obvious because if you can get to it, you're more likely to get to it. But the assumption has been challenged, and it's always good to have data around that kind of claim. So in this year, a third of all, 31% of all journal articles are available as OA, and 52% of article views came from OA journals. So that's a significant difference and supports the claim that OA has value in terms of access. There are some challenges to what Plan S is promoting. The cost of investing in transition, and that's why it's important that Wellcome and other big funders are behind Plan S, because they're actually willing to pay publishers to get to this enlightened state. And they're still working out the cost distribution, who carries the burden of costs among all the stakeholders in the publishing process. Again, apologies to those of you who may have seen this summary slide yesterday when I was speaking in the panel. This is sort of my nutshell of why it's so important, scholarly communication is so important for accelerating science in Africa. The greater viewability or number of views of open access journals is just explained. The ownership of rights for African scientists to their own work, so they're not exploited or denied the benefits of their own output. Transparent review, so everyone can benefit from that intellectual exchange. Community participation, the opportunity to publish varied research objects, as I was talking about before, credit for constructive participation and over and above authorship. This is an area, in addition to peer review, that I think more work can be done on. I know there are various efforts to give better exposure to people who participate in the peer review process thoughtfully and generously, but there's still a real imbalance between the effort that it takes to review and the return the reviewer gets in terms of professional exposure, money, and other resources that are valuable to her. Development of article level metrics to get us away definitively from the impact factor, the opportunity to publish on a dynamic platform even after indexing. You can, because of the versioning function, you can continue to provide new data that readers of the original, of the published article will be able to access if that new data isn't worthy of a new submission. The last thing I just wanted to say is that my prediction for the STM publishing industry, not just in Africa and worldwide, is that the legacy subscription journals, Nature, Cell Science, and the Life Sciences, Lancet, whatever, will probably survive indefinitely. There's just so much history and cachet behind those titles. OA will thrive and continue to grow in the marketplace until it dominates the marketplace, which it's coming quite close to doing, actually. Right now, it's about 30% of all scientific publishing is done OA. I think that will probably flip in the next 5 years, so that 70% of publishing in science will be OA. But everything in the middle, the kind of mid-tier, including scientific society publishers, will probably fall away because the funding for subscription-based journals is drying up, increasing pressure is being put on publishers, scientific societies, governments, et cetera, to make their content available. Now money is actively being put into helping journals make this transition. So I think the entire mid-tier of scientific publishing, which are not fully gold open access, but aren't the legacy journals, which are the majority of journals by far in terms of numbers, they will fall under their own weight. They won't be sustainable. And what we'll have for options is either progressive gold OA or more, which I consider the AAS Open Research to be, or those, dozen or so titles, which, are the Tiffany of publishing to many people still. So that's all I had to say. If you'd like to engage me, I don't know if we have time for questions now, but I'll be around all day. I'm at the Cool Kids table there with Samin and Eric. Thank you very much for the opportunity to join me today.
That was fascinating. Thank you. I think we have about 15 minutes for questions. So please use the microphone to ask questions so that people following the live stream can catch your question. And please introduce yourself. We have a microphone here and one in the back.
I think that was extremely interesting. I'm an economist, and part of a group called the National Bureau of Economic Research. And this is like a club divided into subclubs, and you're not automatically in it. You have to be approved and invited. But once you're in there, then you can publish online, and your work is automatically disseminated to this sort of study group of maybe 40 or 50 people. And to me, that's hugely important because it eliminates the negativity of the peer review, which is often inappropriately enforcing rules of conduct, of style, and methods of data analysis, and choice of theories. So this frees you. And then many of these papers are then published, but the critical thing is it gets access immediately to a very critical group of individuals, and they make their own decisions as to whether they're going to cite you or not. That's the critical thing, is whether you get noticed.
This sounds similar to Paul Ginsberg's archive, that it started, or how it was originally launched. It started out as essentially a very small number of people. It was intended to be an opportunity for colleagues to interact around a paper and help each other improve their paper, and then many of them went on to become publications. Is that
That's
the case?
exactly right.
Yeah,
there.
yeah. No, it's great, and I'm well familiar with Neighbor, and I think it's great that that you've taken advantage of these opportunities, which after all didn't exist before those of us old enough to remember before the internet didn't exist then, because it's the technology that gave us the opportunity to interact and to be immediate in the way that we are. Thank you.
Hi, Elizabeth. Lars Villehuber. Economist as well, but my question I think is more general because we've discussed this in a variety of forums. How do you handle the fact that not all data can ethically or for whatever reason be made easily available? That may be genomic data, say, or it may be just too big for the particular platform. How do you handle that at this platform?
So good question. When it comes to medically sensitive data, for example, anything that might violate a HIPAA law, that kind of thing, anything that actively shouldn't be shared for ethical or confidentiality reasons, an exception is made there. Or we help the author through a process of anonymizing to make it accessible in a format that works. And in terms of it being technically too big for us to handle, we actually, first of all, we haven't experienced it being too big for us to handle because that's what we're set up to do. So that hasn't been an issue. Having said that, if people want to post it in their field-specific repository and just have the AAS Open Research site linked to it, that's fine with us, as long as it's accessible without barriers. So we work with authors to accommodate their preferences and certainly to protect their ethical obligations.
Apparently no other questions. I have a different question, and that regards the copyright issue. So while the primary focus of classical journals has been to acquire and then monetize the copyright of those articles, moving purely to CC BY or something like that has some concerns. We discussed it when we founded a journal as well, about, well, who enforces that I continue to have those rights? So while a journal, because it has money attached to it, has the resources to possibly police misuse or copyright infringement or things like that, I, as an individual who is then the copyright holder of that, don't necessarily. I don't know if somebody's selling my article or something like that, which he would need my approval for, but he never asked and I never detected it.
Right.
How's that more generally handled in sort of these open platforms?
I take your point. I agree that it's at least a theoretical danger, and there's nobody out there actively looking for bad actors. When you own your own copyright, you're not a lawyer, you're an economist, and you don't have a team of lawyers around you. Maybe Rudy Giuliani will be available soon. But yeah, you're somewhat on your own in that regard. But it's sort of a situation of buyer beware. I mean, if I were looking to, for example, compile a book made of selected articles and so forth, I can't imagine that I wouldn't be cautious about making sure I had the rights to reprint that. In terms of black market stuff, it's going to happen. It's going to happen, and it would be up to you to protect your rights. But generally, there's not a lot of monetizing to be done around an individual article, and if it is visible enough that money is being made off of it, then you would know.
Great, thanks for that talk, Elizabeth. I have a question, which is, how has the reception been? It sounds like the platform is pretty new. Especially, I'm curious about reception in the social sciences, given the room here, most of us are social sciences, in the social sciences, and whether there have been any sort of unexpected challenges or pushback. I mean, everything you've laid out is such an appealing vision, but I'm wondering if sort of in practice, how it's been received.
Yeah, good point. I would say the biggest challenge in the first year was that authors, we didn't fully or sufficiently, we understood in retrospect, explain what the process was. And so once they were published, that is, once they submitted their work in an acceptable format, they thought they could forget about it, because that was, once they were published in a more standard journal, they could forget about it. And then they would come back to us and say, well, why isn't my work showing up in PubMed? So we had to provide more information in terms of, no, you have to respond to the reviews, and the quicker you respond to the reviews, the quicker you'll get to the level of indexing, and your job is not over just because the publishing comes early in the process. I would say that was the most stark learning we had in the first year, and it continues to be a little bit of an issue, but because we know we have to be more active in letting people know that that's a critical step, and word is sort of getting out among authors that that's required of them. That's being mitigated as a problem. The social sciences. Not as many submissions as we would like from the social sciences. One of our big funded programs that gets tens of millions of dollars from us, we don't have a lot of these programs, they're very selected, is at the nexus of mental health and behavioral sciences. It's based in Southern Africa, and we have had output from them with social scientists being prominent contributors. But we don't have a lot of social science submissions because we don't have a lot of social science in Africa, or at least that is sort of part of our primary constituency. So I would love to do anything we could to build that.
Hi, I'm Benjamin Daniels from Georgetown. I have a bit of a boring technical...
Sorry, I can't see you.
I'm right here behind the
Thank
projector. There's no way you can see me with the light in my eyes like that. Sorry. I have a bit of a boring technical question for you. As authors are going through the revision process and even the initial submission process, how flexible are you on, file formats for stuff that gets received and change markup? Will you accept anything in any format, or that's where I spend a lot of time in submissions with other types of journals?
Yeah. This is why we're partnering with F1000, because they have a lot of experience in working with authors in terms of the format. I'm not a technical person, so I can't tell you which formats are accepted and which aren't. But I do know that that's not been an issue with us, because we have this partnership with these publishers who have had to cut their teeth on those issues with Gates Open Research, Welcome Open Research, and actually we were the third open platform that they launched, but now there have been dozens more. So not a big issue, and one of our framing principles is that we'll work with you, we'll make it work. We're not rigid about dictating what the formats are.
I have a question from actually someone who's joining via the live stream. She's curious, her name is Alex Jakubowski, she's at SIGA, a postdoc. and she's curious how the peer reviewers are selected.
Exactly. Oh, thank you for bringing up who the peer reviewers are. I meant to touch on that. They're selected in the same way that any journal selects peer reviewers. They look for people in the field who would be expert, et cetera. One disappointing feature, I guess I could include this in the challenges, Ted, that you were asking about, is by definition our papers come from the global south. Most of our reviewers come from the global north. And it's made us realize that, first of all, we need to develop better peer review networks in the global south, more incentives to peer review in the global south, and probably outright training on how to peer review in the global south. So this is a discrepancy that it's going to be important to tackle at some point. And by the way, journals in the global north should also be soliciting peer reviewers in the global south. And that I imagine has an even greater disparity. I don't have data on it.
I also have another question, but if people, I don't want to dominate the floor.
Hi. What about retraction of papers or projects? How does that work? Does it work?
Yeah, so we haven't had a retraction yet, but if there is a retraction, it would physically stay there, but it would be prominently marked that it had been retracted. I'm going to modify your question because it's a more common question that I get, and that is, what if the paper is rejected? It's just sitting up there saying, I'm rejected. Isn't that potentially harmful to my career? Well, the answer to that is technically nothing's ever rejected, it's just not yet accepted. So you can continue to get more peer reviews. You can suggest peer reviewers which will be independently validated for conflict of interest and expertise by F1000, and you can continue to modify your work in response to the peer reviews so that you can eventually, in theory, you can eventually get your paper accepted. But it is true that papers can linger for a long time in a not yet accepted state. And that is, if you consider it a risk, it's a risk of publishing on this sort of platform. I personally, and this may be Pollyannish, don't think of it as a risk. I think it is as an opportunity to get more feedback and improve your work.
What share of papers that are currently on the platform have been indexed?
I should know that, but I don't. I can certainly let you know.
Okay.
It's
Because I imagine you get a lot of submissions for
exactly
the number that are
it's less than
approved.
50%.
Okay.
I can tell you that for sure because, as I say, the platform's only 3 years old, and that's the longest interval that people experience, the point at which it can be indexed. So I can tell you for sure fewer than half have been. If it's indexed, no, it stays up on the site forever. Yeah.
Hi, I apologize for a slightly different topic, but I'm curious, does the African Academy of Sciences police or provide any guidance on research ethics?
Yes, we do. Actually, we have a number of programs that address that. First of all, it's integrated into our grants, and so there's a whole ethics component that grantees have to submit to, if you will, to be able to receive a grant. But also we have independent workshops and resources that we offer people whether or not they're getting a grant through the AAS.